Right now, a little over 4 light-years from the bed where you are lying, a radio wave is still traveling toward Earth. It has been on its way for years, and it is on its way still, and it does not know that you are here waiting for it. Because in April of 2019, a telescope in the Australian outback spent 30 hours listening to the nearest star system to our own, and it recorded something that nobody noticed. Not that night, not that season, not that year. The recording sat untouched in an archive for 14 months, until a summer intern named Shane Smith opened an old file and found one thing inside it: a razor-thin, single tone, holding steady at 982 megahertz, drifting, slowly, in the wrong direction. Coming from a patch of sky only 16 arc minutes across, a sliver about a quarter the width of a fingernail held up against the dark, and centered almost perfectly on Proxima Centauri. It was not static. It was not a passing satellite. It passed every check that had ever been built to catch a hoax. And here is the part that almost no one has right about what came next. The world was told that scientists had found something they could not explain. And then, quietly, the story went dark. It was never called alien. And it was never called solved either. Let that distance settle in the room with you for a moment, because your mind will want to shrink it, and you should not let it. A little over 4 light-years comes to nearly 25 trillion miles. If you started driving tonight at highway speed and never once stopped, not for sleep, not for fuel, not for anything at all, you would still be driving when the sun burned out. Proxima Centauri is the closest star to our own, the nearest thing in all the sky to a neighbor, and it is still so far away that the fastest thing we know of, light itself, needs more than 4 years to make the crossing. The tone that telescope caught had already been traveling that whole distance before anyone alive had ever heard of it, and the listening itself was small against all of that. 30 hours. Not 30 years of patient watching, not a lifetime bent over an eyepiece. 30 hours, spread across a handful of nights at the end of April and into May, a single dish in New South Wales turning its ear toward one star. For almost all of that time, the sky offered up nothing but noise, the ordinary hiss of a working universe. And then, on one narrow band, a note. Just one. 982 megahertz. So pure and so thin that it looked less like weather and more like something switched on. It was creeping upward in pitch, the way a fire engine climbs as it comes toward you, shifting by less than a single hertz each second. A drift so faint you could sit with it for an hour and barely see it move. Everything about it was quiet, and yet everything about it was wrong, in precisely the way a real transmission from another world might be wrong. So here is what you are actually holding tonight, before we go any deeper into it. Not a story about little green men, and not a tidy story about a simple mistake, either. This is the story of one note that seemed to cross the emptiness between 2 stars, and slipped past every trap that careful people had laid for exactly this kind of false hope. It is the story of the machine that caught it, the star it appeared to come from, the long year it waited in the dark before anyone looked, and the slow, reluctant work of trying to explain it away. It is a story about how hard it is to be certain of anything at all. Most people who remember hearing about this remember one of 2 endings. Some are sure it turned out to be aliens, quietly confirmed and quietly buried. Others are just as sure it turned out to be nothing, some phone or microwave or satellite laughed off inside a week. Neither of those is what happened. Not the first, not the second. Something stranger sits in the gap between them, and it is that gap we are going to walk through, slowly, together. There is no need to hold any of these numbers too tightly. Let them be large. Let them be far away. Let them pass through you, and stay soft while we begin to close the distance. So let us close it. Not all at once. Nothing tonight needs to happen all at once. We will begin with the star, because before there was a signal, there was a place the signal seemed to come from, and that place has a name, and it sits closer to you than any other star in the whole of the sky. Its name is Proxima Centauri, and the word Proxima means, quite simply, nearest. Of all the countless suns scattered through the dark, this is the one that is closest to our own, 4.2465 light-years away. Say that number slowly and it sounds almost gentle. 4 and a little more. You could hold 4 of nearly anything. But a light-year is not a thing you hold. It is the distance light itself must travel across one whole year without ever slowing. And light is the fastest thing there is. The glow from a lamp across your room reaches your eyes faster than you can notice it happening. That same light aimed at Proxima Centauri would take more than 4 years to arrive. The faint beam that touched the telescope on the night this story truly begins had left that star over 4 years earlier, crossing all of that emptiness while, back here, people were born and grew and forgot whole seasons of their own lives. If you wanted to travel there yourself, not as light but as a body in a car, moving at the speed you take on an open road, you would not arrive in a lifetime, or in 100 lifetimes. You would still be driving after 50 million years. That is the nearest star. That is the near one. Let that rest for a moment. Let it be as far away as it truly is, and let yourself stay exactly where you are, warm and still, and close to the ground. And yet, near in the only way the word can mean anything to us, Proxima Centauri does not sit alone. It carries at least one world. Astronomers have found a planet circling it, and they call it, without much ceremony, Proxima b. It is a small world, close to the mass of the Earth, not some swollen giant of gas, but something you might almost recognize. Something with the weight of solid ground beneath it. It moves inside what we call the habitable zone, that narrow band around a star, where a world is neither so close that its water boils into nothing, nor so far that everything locks into ice. The thin ring where liquid water, and perhaps more than water, could hold on. But it hugs its star. It hugs it far more tightly than the Earth hugs the Sun. Proxima b circles at just under 5/100ths of the distance between the Earth and our own star, so close that a full year there, one entire journey around its Sun, lasts only 11.2 days. Picture that for a moment. A birthday every 11 days. A world where a season is barely longer than a week. And because Proxima Centauri is a smaller, cooler, redder star than ours, that closeness is the only thing keeping the little planet warm enough to matter at all. Now here is the part that turns the picture gently dark. Proxima Centauri is what astronomers call a flare star. It does not burn steadily and kindly the way our sun mostly does. It seethes. It snaps. In 2019, inside the very same stretch of years this whole story lives within, astronomers caught it flinging out a single enormous flare of ultraviolet light, a burst roughly 10 times more energetic than the very strongest flares our own sun has ever been recorded to make. 10 times worse than the worst our star has ever shown us. And that flare washed straight across the small world circling close beside it. We do not know, and this is honest uncertainty, whether a planet can keep an atmosphere under that kind of battering. A thin skin of air, the fragile membrane that here on Earth lets you breathe and holds the cold and the radiation out, might simply be stripped away, peeled off into space, flare after flare, across the long ages. So the nearest almost Earth-like world we have ever found may be a scoured and airless rock. Or it may not be. As far as anyone can honestly say, we do not yet know. Hold both of those quietly, at the same time. The nearest door we have, and no certainty at all about what waits behind it. This, then, is the star. Close and violent, and carrying a world we cannot read. This is what our machines were aimed at when the whistle came, but we did not begin by pointing them at Proxima Centauri. The habit of listening, of turning a great dish toward the dark, and simply waiting to overhear something we were never meant to hear, is older than that. And it began, the way so many of these things do, not with a plan, but with a surprise. Go back to a warm night in the American Midwest, to the 15th of August, 1977. In the state of Ohio there stood a radio telescope so large and so strangely shaped that the people who tended it had given it a plain and affectionate name. They called it the Big Ear. It did not move quickly, or really at all. It lay still and let the turning of the earth sweep the sky slowly across its gaze, and it wrote down whatever it heard as long columns of numbers and letters printed on paper. A man named Jerry Eman carried those sheets home to read by hand, days after the sky itself had already drifted on. And on one of those sheets, he found something that stopped him, a burst of radio sound, narrow and sharp and strong, far stronger than the quiet hiss of the background around it, about 30 times louder than the emptiness it rose out of. It had come, and it had gone in 72 seconds, swelling and fading exactly the way a fixed point in the sky should as the Big Ear slid past it, and it had come from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. It sat near a frequency of 1420 megahertz, a place on the radio dial that means something to astronomers, because it is the very note that hydrogen itself sings. Hydrogen, the most common substance in the entire universe, the frequency that anyone hoping to be overheard might reasonably choose. Eman looked at those numbers. He took a red pen, and beside them, in the margin of the printout, he wrote a single word. Wow. That word became its name. The wow signal, people have called it ever since. It was never a proof of anything. It was a whisper heard once, and then never again, no matter how many nights and how many patient years. They turned the great dish back toward Sagittarius and asked it, softly, to speak a second time. It never did. And that, more than the strength of it, more than the strangeness of it, is the thing that has quietly haunted the people who listen for nearly 50 years now. Not that they heard something, that they heard it exactly once. Keep that word close. The once. It is going to matter more tonight than almost any number I can give you, because everything that comes after it, all of the machinery and the money and the careful, reluctant checking still ahead of us in this story, was built, in a sense, to answer it. Built so that if we ever heard something like that again, we would not have to spend half a century simply wondering. We would be able to turn straight back and listen a second time, and a third, and finally know. But in 1977, that machinery did not exist. There was a single dish standing in an Ohio field, and a man with a red pen, and the whole enterprise of searching the sky for other minds was small enough, and odd enough, and thin enough on funding, that it lived mostly out at the edges of respectable science. It was something you did quietly, on borrowed hours and borrowed telescopes, half apologizing for it as you went. One dish. One night. One word in a margin. Set that picture down gently, because we are about to watch it grow, slowly, decade by decade, into something you would hardly recognize beside it. For a long time the search stayed small. It lived on the patience of a few, on stolen hours and modest grants, listening to a single star at a time, and then falling silent again whenever the money ran dry. And the sky is not a small thing to search. There are more stars in our own galaxy alone than there are seconds in a long human life, and every one of them is a place a signal might arrive from, at any frequency, at any hour, lasting for a span of time that might be even shorter than the 72 seconds Jerry Heeman happened to catch by sheer luck. To listen to all of them, truly, patiently, one by one, you would need something far larger than a lone dish and a handful of devoted people. You would need a machine the size of a continent's worth of ambition. You would need a fortune. And you would need a decade of quiet nights in which to spend it. That fortune came, though it arrived from an unlikely direction. On the 20th of July, 2015, in a great room at the Royal Society in London, the physicist Stephen Hawking stood with a Russian technology investor named Yuri Milner and together they told the world that the listening was about to become serious. They announced a program called Breakthrough Listen, and they set behind it a number no lone astronomer had ever been allowed to dream of. $100 million. 10 years, not a single star at a time, snatched between other people's deadlines, but the 1 million nearest stars to our own sun, surveyed one after another, along with the whole flat plane of the galaxy and its crowded, glittering heart. You do not need to hold that number. Let it pass through you. 1 million stars is not a thing the mind can picture, and it is not asking to be pictured tonight. If you tried to name them, one every second, out loud, without ever stopping, you would still be naming them when this night ended, and when the next one ended, and you would grow old with the list barely begun, and your children would inherit the counting, and their children after them. So let it be only a soft wait for a breath, and then set it down. The men who announced it spoke that night about the size of the question, about a universe too large, they felt, to be truly empty, about how it was finally time to listen as though the answer mattered. And with that, quietly, everything that had come before began to look small. Jerry Amon and his single printed page, the lone dishes turning through the 1970s, listening to one star and then falling silent for want of money. All of it, the patient work of a village, beside a budget that could have bought a fleet of those old dishes outright. Instead, the money bought time, which is the one thing the search had always run out of first. The machines they aimed at the sky were not new, but they had never been held open with such patience. In the green hills of West Virginia there stands a dish 100 meters across, wide enough to cradle a football field, with room to spare along its rim. And on the far side of the world, in the dry farmland of New South Wales in Australia, there is a second bowl, 64 meters across, a great pale ear that carries the name Muriang. These were the instruments. What Breakthrough Listen supplied was simply the will to keep them turned upward, night after night, star after star. And so we come to the star itself. On the 29th of April, 2019, and across the weeks that followed, the dish at Parkes turned away from the crowded lanes of the galaxy and settled its gaze on a single, unremarkable point of red light. Not a bright star. Not a star you have ever seen, or ever could see, with your bare eyes from the darkest field on Earth. But the closest one there is, Proxima Centauri, 4.2465 light-years away. Say that distance slowly, and let its size soften you rather than sharpen you. If you could somehow drive there, in a car, at the speed of a highway, never once stopping to sleep, the journey would not take years. It would take longer than our whole species has existed. Light itself, the fastest thing there is, needs more than 4 years to cross that gap. To call out a single hello toward that nearest door, and to hear one word come back, would take more than 8 years. Longer than a small child takes to learn to read and write. And that gap is the short one. That is our nearest neighbour. That is the house next door. Over roughly 30 hours of listening, spread across those cool southern nights, the telescope simply held still, and let the star pour its faint radio light down into the bowl. 30 hours is not long. It is a single working week. It is less time than you will spend asleep across the next 4 nights. And the sky does not care how long we watch. A signal out there might last a lifetime, or it might last a single breath, and the dish can only ever hear what happens to be arriving in the hours it is listening. In that ordinary handful of hours, with no one in the control room the wiser, something arrived. But before we sit with what arrived, you should know what kind of star it is, because Proxima Centauri is not the calm red ember its distance might suggest. In that same year, 2019, astronomers caught it in a moment of fury. A single flare tore off its surface, a burst of ultraviolet light roughly 10 times more energetic than the strongest flare our own sun has ever been recorded throwing. 10 times. Picture the worst storm the sun has ever aimed at the Earth. The kind that can buckle power grids and set the northern sky on fire, and then imagine it 10 times fiercer, thrown by a star that holds its one known world far, far closer than the sun holds ours. That world has a name too. Proxima b, a planet about the mass of our own, circling that small violent star so tightly that a single year there, one full orbit, takes only 11.2 days. It sits at roughly 1/20th of the distance that lies between the Earth and the Sun, close enough that it may be warm enough for liquid water to gather on its surface, and close enough that every one of those flares washes straight across it. Whether anything could endure there, whether it could hold on to an atmosphere at all against that endless battering, is a question no one can yet answer. It is a world we have come to know only recently, and already it is one of the most closely listened to points in the entire sky. You are allowed to let all of that go for a moment. The flares, the distance, the impossible ocean between here and there. None of it needs you to solve it tonight. Let your shoulders drop a little lower into the bed. Let the numbers drift past you like weather, and let your breathing slow to meet them. So this was the target, a near, small, angry star with one possible world clenched against its chest. A little over 4 light years down, the closest harbour on the shore of an ocean we have no ship to cross. And the great dish at Parkes wrote down 30 hours of its radio voice, and the recordings were labelled, and stored, and set carefully aside, and everyone moved on to the next star, and the next, and the one after that. 1,000,000 of them, still waiting to be heard. The recordings sat. For a full turn of the seasons, they sat. Southern autumn gave way to winter, and the world went about its enormous ordinary business, and a whole year of human days rose and set, and inside that archive, in a river of numbers no living person had yet looked at closely, a single thin thread of radio lay waiting to be found. It waited in perfect patience, asking for nothing, announcing nothing, and then, in June of 2020, a young man named Shane Smith, an undergraduate intern working with the Breakthrough Listen team, sat down to comb back through that year-old Proxima data, searching for exactly the kind of needle that everyone had quietly agreed would not be there. Here is the crushing truth of it, the one to carry down with you towards sleep. Of all the millions of stars that whole empire of money and glass and patience had been built to listen to, the very first one to seem to answer back was the one right next door, and it had been whispering into an unopened drawer for an entire year before a single human being turned, at last, to look. Consider what it actually means to search a river of radio for a single thread. Shane Smith was not listening to anything. That is the first thing to let go of. No hiss came through a speaker, no crackle, no lonely tone rising out of static in a darkened room. The data was already a year cold, already frozen into files, already turned from waves in the air into long columns of numbers, stored on spinning discs in a building far from the telescope that made them. What he did that June was open those numbers and ask a machine to draw them as a picture. And the picture radio astronomers draw is a kind of falling curtain. Frequency runs one way across it, time runs the other, and the brightness of each tiny square tells you how much energy arrived there. Most of that curtain is soft grey noise, the endless warm murmur of the universe and the instrument itself. A snow that never stops falling. You learn to read it the way you learn to read the surface of moving water. You are not looking for something loud, you are looking for something that does not belong. And in the Proxima data, something did not belong. A line, not a smear, not a blush, not a broad wash of energy spread across the dial the way a storm or an engine or a star's own churning would spread it. A line, thin as a hair, bright and narrow and vertical, standing straight up out of the grey, holding to almost a single exact frequency the way a held note holds to a single pitch. In the language of the people who do this work, it was narrowband, and narrowband is the word that makes their hands go still. Because nature, as far as anyone has ever found, does not sing in a single pure note. Stars are broadband, dust is broadband, lightning, black holes, the collapse of enormous things, All of it arrives smeared across the spectrum like light through frosted glass. A tone this pure, this needle thin, is the signature of something built. A cavity tuned to resonate. A circuit made to oscillate. A machine, somewhere, deciding on one frequency and staying there. The frequency it chose to stay at was 982.002 MHz. Hold that number lightly for a moment, because it is going to matter more than it seems to now. A megahertz is 1,000,000 cycles every second, 1,000,000 tiny risings and fallings in the space of one of your slow breaths, and 982 of them is a busy, crowded stretch of the radio neighborhood, not far below the frequencies your own devices whisper on. But set the crowding aside for now. Let it wait. What one of the scientists, Sofia Sheikh, said about the shape of the thing is the part to carry down with you. It was, she said, just a tone. Just one note. Not a melody. Not a pattern. Not a rhythm of long and short that might carry a message the way our own signals do, folding words and pictures into the trembling of the wave. There was no modulation at all. No information riding on its back, nothing to decode. Only a single clear pitch, sustained, patient, arriving from the direction of the nearest star to our own, and holding. But a held note by itself is not enough to stop anyone's breath. There was a second strangeness, quieter than the first, and it lived in the way the note moved. Because it did move. Over the hours, the pitch of it climbed. Very slowly, at a rate of about 0.038 Hz each second, so gentle a slide that you could sit and watch and never catch it happening, the way you never catch the minute hand of a clock in motion and only ever notice that it has moved. The frequency drifted upward, steadily, hour after hour, and here is where the small hairs on the back of a radio astronomer's neck begin to lift. Because a thing sitting still on the Earth, a tower, a phone, a satellite passing overhead, all of these leave a fingerprint on a signal as our planet turns beneath them, and that fingerprint has a shape and a direction that the people who hunt these things know by heart. This drift went the other way. It leaned against the grain. It climbed in the direction that a fixed thing on Earth would not climb, and instead climbed the way you might expect from a transmitter mounted on something moving, something turning, something accelerating far away. Something, say, riding on the surface of a planet as that planet swung around a distant sun. Let that sit for a breath, and let your shoulders come down from wherever they have crept. You do not need to solve it, you only need to feel the shape of it. A single pure note, drifting the wrong way, arriving from 4.2465 light-years off, from the one star out of 1,000,000 that anyone had any special reason to care about. Now, if you have ever wondered how anyone tells a true whisper from the sky, apart from the vast ocean of human noise we make down here, this is the moment to understand it, because it is the heart of everything that follows. The telescope does not simply stare at the star and trust what it hears. It nods. Through those 30 hours at parks across the end of April and into May of 2019, the great dish did not hold still on Proxima Centauri and drink it in. It looked at the star, and then it looked away. On the star, off the star, on again, off again, in patient blocks of about 30 minutes each, swinging its enormous ear to the target, and then swinging it to a patch of empty sky nearby, and then swinging it back. This is the nodding cadence, and it is one of the oldest and simplest lies detectors in all of science. The reasoning is beautiful in its plainness. Anything made on Earth, any hum from the control room, any passing aircraft, any stray leak from a microwave oven warming someone's dinner in a farmhouse over the hills, will be there whether the dish points at the star or points at the dark beside it. Local noise does not care where the telescope is aimed. It floods in from all around. So a real signal, a signal genuinely coming from that one point in the sky, will appear only when the dish faces the star, and will vanish the instant the dish looks away. It will blink on and off in perfect step with the nodding. And a fake, a piece of homegrown interference dressed up in starlight, will not. it will simply stay. The thin bright line at 982 MHz blinked on and off with the nod. When the dish faced Proxima, it was there. When the dish looked to the empty sky beside it, it was gone. On, off, keeping time with the great slow turning of the machine, exactly as a true signal from that star should. And more than that, when they traced back along the beam to ask precisely where in the sky it seemed to be coming from, it did not sprawl vaguely across the heavens. It tightened to within about 16 arc-minutes of the star. 16 arc-minutes is roughly a quarter of 1 degree, a patch of sky you could hide behind the very tip of your smallest finger held at arm's length in the dark. In all the enormous vault above you, the thing had drawn itself down to that one small circle, and Proxima Centauri sat inside it. So it was narrowband, which nature does not do. It drifted the wrong way, which local things do not do. It passed the nodding test, which interference is not supposed to pass. It pinned itself to within a fingertip of the one star everyone was watching. Check after check after check. The kind of checks built by people who have spent their whole careers being fooled and learning not to be. And this signal walked through all of them and came out the other side still standing. The man who ran the whole search, Andrew Simeon, put it in words that are almost unbearable in their restraint. It has some particular properties, he said, that caused it to pass many of our checks. And, he said, we cannot yet explain it. We cannot yet explain it. Sit with the honesty of that for a moment, the way a good scientist sits with it, which is to say without leaping, without deciding, holding the not knowing steady in an open hand. There is a particular sensation that lives in the body when a thing you are certain could not happen appears to be happening anyway. It is not quite fear. It is a kind of vertigo, a floor tilting very gently underfoot, the quiet lurch of a mind reaching for the railing of everything it thought was solid and finding the railing has moved. Somewhere in California, in the weeks after that intern found the thread in the year-old data, a small number of people were living inside that exact sensation, carrying it home at night, lying awake with it. The nearest star had seemed to speak in a single clear note, and every test they knew how to throw at it had failed to catch it in a lie. They had not announced anything. They had not told the world. They were only checking, and checking again, and checking a third time, because they of all people knew how many ways the universe has of teasing a hopeful listener with a shape that looks like an answer. And still the note held, and still they could not explain it, and still, night after night, the question sat with them in the dark, refusing to resolve, growing not smaller, but slowly, quietly, larger. To understand why the note would not let them go, you have to understand the machine that heard it, and the strange narrow kind of listening it does. Picture a dish of white steel set down in a paddock of dry grass in New South Wales, 64 meters across, wide enough to hold a swimming pool, wide enough that a small crowd could stand inside its curve and still not touch the rim. The people who have always belonged to that country called that patch of sky Moriang, the home of the sky world, and the great dish carries the name now. For more than half a century it has tipped its face upward and gathered the faintest rain of radio light, energy so weak that the warmth of your own hand, held up toward the stars, would outshine nearly everything it has ever collected across all its patient years. That is the scale of the quiet it works in. It is not listening for a voice. It is listening for a narrowness. Because here is the thing nature almost never does. Nature is loud across a whole spread of frequencies at once. A star roars in a broad, smeared band. A cloud of gas hums over a wide range. Lightning, the churn of a galaxy, the slow burn of dust, all of it bleeds across the dial, blurred and generous. What nature almost never makes is a single, pure, needle-thin tone, one exact frequency and nothing on either side of it. That kind of purity is the fingerprint of a machine. It is what a transmitter does, a made thing, a built thing, something with a dial and an intention behind it. So the searchers are not hunting for words or patterns or codes. They are hunting for a line so thin it should not be there. A whistle held on one note in a universe that only ever seems to know how to shout. And to keep themselves honest, they nod. This is the method, and it is beautifully simple. Point the dish at the star for a stretch of 30 minutes and record everything. Then swing it away, off to an empty patch of nearby sky, and record that for 30 minutes too. Then, back to the star. Then, away again. On and off, and on and off. The great white face nodding slowly toward Proxima Centauri, and away from it, through the long cold hours of the outback night. The logic underneath it is a trap laid for liars. Anything born on Earth, a phone tower, a passing aircraft, a microwave door left open in the observatory kitchen, a satellite sliding overhead, will not care where the dish is pointed. It will bleed into the on and the off alike, into the star scans and the empty scans without distinction, and so it can be caught and quietly thrown away. Only a signal that arrives when the dish faces the star and vanishes when the dish looks elsewhere has any right to be called a signal from the star itself. That is the test the note passed. Across 30 hours of watching, gathered in the last days of April and into the first days of May, the whistle came only when Muriang was turned toward Proxima Centauri. It was gone in the empty scans. It returned in the pointed ones. It behaved, in other words, exactly as a true transmission from that exact star would behave, and exactly as a piece of local junk should not. And when they finally pinned down where on the sky it seemed to sit, it fell within 16 arc minutes of the star, an arc minute being a 60th of a single degree, so that the whole box of uncertainty was smaller than a quarter of the width of the moon as you see it from your pillow. Not the general direction of Proxima, not the neighborhood. The doorstep. Then there was the note itself, and this is where a scientist first felt the floor tilt. A single frequency, 982 megahertz, give or take a whisper, sitting alone with silence on both shoulders. One of the researchers, Sofia Sheikh, would later reach for the plainest possible words to describe it. Just a tone, she said, just one note. There was no rhythm inside it, no rising and falling, no bundled message, nothing that carried information the way a broadcast carries a song. It was the cosmic equivalent of a held breath, one clear pitch sustained in the dark, the sort of thing you could hum to yourself without trying, and you can let it be exactly that for a moment. You do not need to hold the frequency or keep the number. Let it pass through you like a single low note played somewhere down the hall, and let your shoulders ease while it fades. But the note was not perfectly still. Over the hours it drifted, its pitch climbing very slowly upward, the way a held tone on a distant instrument might bend if the player were walking gradually toward you across a wide field. And the direction of that drift was the detail that made the hair stand up. As the Earth turns and swings beneath the sky, our own motion smears a fixed, faraway source in a particular, predictable way, and that expected smear runs one direction. This one ran the other. It climbed when it should have fallen. It moved as though the thing making it were not sitting still on solid ground at all, but accelerating, gently gaining speed, exactly the way a transmitter would if it were riding on the surface of a spinning world, or circling one. A small machine on a small planet turning its face toward us, and then away. The drift was tiny, a change of less than 0.04 of 1 hertz each second, a motion so slight you would need the whole patience of a telescope to notice it. But it was the wrong slightness. It leaned the wrong way, and it pointed, of all the directions it could have chosen, toward the possibility no one in that room was yet willing to say out loud. Hold all of that in your body for a moment, the way those few people were holding it. A pure tone that nature does not make on its own, arriving only when the dish faced the nearest star, vanishing when it looked away, sitting on the star's own doorstep in the sky, drifting as though it rode on a moving world, every property lining up, one after another, on the side of the answer our species has been aching for since it first understood that the points of light overhead were other suns. The astronomer directing the whole effort, a man named Andrew Simeon, put it as carefully as a person can. It has some particular properties, he said, that caused it to pass many of our checks, and we cannot yet explain it. Say that sentence slowly to yourself, because it is a very disciplined kind of fear. Not, we have found them. Not, it is nothing. Simply, we cannot yet explain it. A door left standing open in a house where every door is supposed to close. You know this feeling in a smaller key. You have had the phone ring at an hour when phones do not ring, and lain there in the dark deciding whether to reach for it, the whole shape of your life balanced for 3 long seconds on which way the news will fall. Multiply that quiet dread by the distance to a star, and let it run, not for 3 seconds, but for weeks. The people who lived closest to this note were not celebrating. They were being careful, the way you are careful with something that might be either the most ordinary thing in the world or the thing that ends the loneliness of an entire species and cannot yet be told apart. So they did the only honest thing left to them. They stopped trusting the note's good behavior, and they began, very quietly, to try to prove that it was lying. To prove that a thing is lying, you do not argue with it. You watch it. You go back over everything it has ever done, every hour it sat quietly inside the machine, and you look for the single moment when its story fails to hold together. That was the work waiting for them now. Not a debate, not a press release, a slow, patient, unglamorous sifting through hours of recorded sky, one narrow slice of frequency at a time, hunting for the seam where a miracle turns back into a mistake. It would take the better part of a year, and in a fair world, the year would have belonged only to them, to the quiet people at their screens, checking and rechecking before they said a word to anyone. But the world does not wait for careful people to finish. The world found out first. On the 18th of December, in the year 2020, before a single line of the formal analysis had been printed, before the papers that would explain the note had even been written, the news of it slipped loose, not through the front door of a scientific journal, the way discoveries are supposed to arrive, with their evidence laid out and their doubts already answered. It came out the side way, the human way, in a newspaper story that reached the public months ahead of the science. A signal, the report said, from the nearest star, from the very direction of the world we have spent a lifetime dreaming, might hold a neighbour. And the phrase that travelled fastest, the one that lodged in every headline, was the one the scientists themselves could not yet take back. We cannot explain it. You can feel, even from here, how that phrase behaves once it leaves the room. Inside the room it means something modest and honest. It means we have not finished our checks. Outside the room, in the wide unguarded air of 100 million phones, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a promise. It becomes the thing people have wanted to hear for as long as there have been people to look up. And once a sentence like that is loose, no amount of careful qualification ever quite catches it again. The people running the search knew this, and they were careful even so. Pete Worden, the man who ran the wider initiative behind the listening, did not tell the world the note was a voice. He told the world the note was almost certainly nothing. He put a number on it, the way honest people do when they are trying to keep everyone's feet on the ground. The most likely explanation, he said, was human interference. Something made by us. Something leaking out of our own machines. And he set the odds of that ordinary answer at roughly 99.9%. Not a door thrown open. A door left the smallest crack ajar, with a careful hand still resting against it, ready to close it the moment the wind changed. Hold that number gently for a moment, because it is a strange one to fall asleep to. 99.9% ordinary, which is another way of saying 1 part in 1,000, unexplained. 1 thin thousandth of a chance, hanging in the space between a star and a dish in the desert, that this was the thing itself. You have made peace with worse odds than that on nights you cannot remember. You have crossed roads, boarded planes, loved people, on longer odds than 1 in 1,000, and thought nothing of it. And yet, set against the loneliness of an entire species, 1 in 1,000 is not small. 1 in 1,000 is enormous. 1 in 1,000 is close enough to keep a careful person awake. But here is the turn, the thing that makes that single trembling note begin to feel small in your hands. Because it was small. Not in what it might have meant, but in what it was, measured against the machine built to catch it. To understand how small, you have to understand what had been built. 5 years before the note arrived, on the 20th of July, in the year 2015, in a panelled room at the Royal Society in London, 2 men stood up to announce a search unlike any that had come before. One was a physicist, whose voice by then came from a machine, the most famous scientist alive, a man who had spent his life thinking about black holes and the beginning of everything. The other was an investor, a man who had made a fortune and decided to spend a piece of it on the oldest question we have. Together they announced a program, and they gave it a scale that had never been tried. $100 million, 10 years, and a target list that does not shrink when you say it slowly, the way most numbers do. The 1 million nearest stars. Say that again to yourself, softly, and let it be the thing you drift on. Not a star, not a handful of promising stars, 1 million of them, one after another, the closest million suns to your own, each to be listened to in turn for any whisper that might not be natural. And beyond the single stars, the flat bright band of the galaxy itself, the plain and the crowded centre, swept for the same faint hope. The listening would be done by some of the largest ears we have ever built. A dish 100 meters across in the hills of West Virginia, and the 64-meter dish in the Australian outback, the one that would, 4 years later, sit pointed at Proxima Centauri and catch the note we have been sitting with all this time. So place the note back into its true setting now. Not a lone cry heard by a lone listener leaning toward the dark. A single narrow tone, one thin thread of frequency, surfacing out of a search designed to comb 1 million stars across 10 years for exactly this. It was not the first thing the search had listened to. It was one candidate among an ocean of hours, one flicker in a machine built precisely on the expectation that most flickers would be false. The wonder was never that the search found something strange. A search that large, listening that hard, was almost guaranteed to find something strange eventually. The wonder was that this particular something was so much harder to dismiss than all the strange things before it, and it was not even the first note of its kind. That is the layer beneath the layer, the older ghost standing behind this one. Because the people at their screens, when they reached for a way to describe what they were looking at, did not reach for a new word. They reached back more than 40 years to another whistle that had done the same thing and had never been explained either. On the 15th of August in the year 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio called the Big Ear was sweeping the sky in the constellation Sagittarius, off toward the crowded heart of the galaxy. It was doing what it always did, printing its readings as columns of numbers and letters on long sheets of paper, quiet and automatic, with no one watching in the moment. Days later, an astronomer named Jerry Eman sat down with the printout and ran his eye down the columns, and he found a sequence that did not belong. A burst of signal rising far above the background hum, some 30 times louder than the empty sky around it, holding for about 72 seconds, and then gone. Narrow, clean, near a frequency the universe itself hums at, close to 1420 megahertz, the note that cold hydrogen sings across all of space. He was so startled that he circled the numbers in red pen and wrote a single word in the margin. Wow. That one word became the name. The wow signal. And in the decades since, telescope after telescope has been turned back toward that same patch of Sagittarius, listening for it to speak again. It never has. Not once. It came, it held for a little over a minute, and it fell silent forever, leaving behind nothing but a circled number on a page and a question no one could close. It was not proven to be them. It was not proven to be us. It simply arrived, and refused to return, and became the standard against which every tantalizing silence since has been measured. So when Sofia Sheikh, one of the scientists closest to the note from Proxima, wanted to explain to the rest of us what kind of thing she was holding, this is what she named. Not a triumph, not a discovery, a comparison to the wow signal, which is to say, a comparison to the most famous unanswered question in the whole history of the listening. A benchmark not for certainty, but for the exact grade of hope that has burned that way before, and left only ash and a red circle behind. Feel how the ground has shifted under this note in the last few minutes, and let your shoulders go a little heavier as it does. It began as one voice, close and strange at the nearest star. Now it stands inside a machine sweeping a million suns, and behind a ghost from 1977 that walked this same road and vanished. The stakes have not fallen. If anything, the dread has grown quieter and deeper. The way a large thing seen from far away is more unsettling than a small thing seen up close. Because if this note followed the wow signal into silence, then we would be left once again with the worst answer of all. Not yes, not no, just another circle in red pen, another star we can never point at again with a clear conscience, another maybe to carry into the next long night. And there was, even then, a way to put a number on how thin the hope truly was. In February of 2021, a small group of researchers did something almost cruel in its calm. They took the oldest and gentlest idea in all of astronomy, the one that says you are probably not standing in a special place at a special moment, and they turned it on this note like a cold, even light. It is called the Copernican principle, and it is nothing more than humility made into arithmetic. It assumes that we are ordinary, that our little window onto the sky is not the one lucky window in all of history. And when they ran that assumption through the numbers, when they asked how likely it truly was that a radio broadcasting civilization was sitting right there at Proxima Centauri, close enough and loud enough and switched on at the exact stretch of days we happened to be listening, the figure they arrived at was roughly 1 in 100 million. Let that number find a shape you can hold in the dark. 1 in 100 million. Picture a stadium filled with 100,000 people, every seat taken, and then imagine 1,000 more stadiums exactly like it, all of them full, a slow ocean of faces you could never finish counting. Somewhere in all of that, on the back of one single hand, you have drawn a small mark. The odds of this signal being real were the odds of reaching into that ocean blind and touching that one marked hand on your very first try. Not merely small, vanishing. A hope so thin you could see the darkness straight through it, the way you can see a light through a held breath. And here the ground tilts a little further, so let your weight settle a little deeper into the bed as it does, because a number like that should have ended it. A tired and rational person, hearing 1 in 100 million, simply lets go, turns off the lamp, forgets the whole thing by morning. But this note would not let its finders go, and it will not quite let you go either, and the reason is very simple and very human. 1 in 100 million is not zero. It is almost nothing. It is a whisper of a chance standing in a whole weather system of doubt. But almost nothing still has a door in it, a hairline crack of a door, and the mind, especially a tired mind lying still in the dark, cannot quite stop looking at that door. Think, too, about what this single note actually was inside the full weight of the machine that caught it. This was not a stray flicker from some idle afternoon. This came out of a program that had promised the sky $100 million and 10 unbroken years of attention. A program that had set out to listen to 1 million of the nearest stars, one after another, patiently, the way you might read 1 million names slowly off a list you never expect to finish. And out of all of that, out of the money, and the decade, and the 1 million stars, and the 2 great dishes turning in the hills of West Virginia and out in the Australian outback, out of every candidate that program had ever flagged and studied and quietly ruled out, this one note, arriving from the very nearest star of them all, was the single most convincing thing they had ever found. the best of everything they had, and its honest odds were still 1 in 100 million. Sit with how small that makes the entire search feel. The most promising signal in the most sensitive search for other minds that human beings had ever mounted, and even so the arithmetic leaned in close and said, almost certainly, no. If the best you can find in 1,000,000 stars is a whisper with those odds, then the silence out there is not an accident of where you happen to point. The silence may simply be the shape of the sky. That is a heavier thought than any single fact in it, and you do not need to carry it. You can let it rest on the far wall of the room, where it can do you no harm. And even if you took that 1 in 100 million and pressed it gently to your chest, even if you chose, just for tonight, to believe, the place it pointed toward was not a kind one. Proxima Centauri is not a warm and steady sun like the one you were born beneath. It is a small red star that flares, that convulses, that throws out sudden storms of radiation without warning. In roughly the same span of years in which this signal was recorded, astronomers watched that star release a single ultraviolet flare about 10 times more violent than the strongest flare our own sun has ever been seen to produce. Imagine standing on a world close enough to that star to be warm, close enough perhaps to hold liquid water if it could only keep its air, and then imagine the whole sky lighting up like that, again and again, across the long ages. Whatever fragile hope you had just pressed to your chest would have to survive that too. The one address the signal seemed to come from is also one of the least forgiving addresses in the entire neighborhood. So follow the if and the then of it, slowly, the way you follow your own breathing. If some patient thing had built a transmitter out there, then it had built it beneath a sky that regularly tries to peel the atmosphere off the ground. If it was calling out toward us, then it was calling from the inside of a storm. And if it was not calling at all, if there was no one there and there never had been, then the note we heard was something else entirely. Something that had crossed no vast distance. Something that had, perhaps, been sitting much closer to home all along. Quiet and unremarkable and right under our own instruments. That last possibility is the soft one. It does not shout. It just waits at the very edge of the story, as patient as the star itself, and it will turn out to be the one that matters most of all. Hold all 3 of these at once now, gently, the way you are holding the slow rise and fall of your own chest. A number that says almost certainly not, a silence out there that will neither confirm nor deny, and a star that could barely keep a single world alive even if a world were truly there. None of the 3 cancels the others. They simply stack, one upon another, and the weight of the whole pile is heavier than any piece of it standing alone. This is the shape of the dread at the top of this long ladder. Not a monster, not a scream in the night. Only a small set of quiet, careful measurements that stubbornly refuse to add up to any comfort. And you do not have to solve a single part of it tonight. You can let the number simply be a number. You can let the star simply be a star, just over 4 light years away, and no concern of yours, no nearer your pillow than it has ever been on any night of your life. Let the weight of that 1 in 100 million rest somewhere well outside your body, out in the room, along the far wall, anywhere at all but inside your chest. Your only task in this moment is to keep breathing, slow and easy, in the dark, while the story keeps its own long vigil without you. Because something was about to shift in how this single note was understood. Not a brighter signal, not a louder one, not even a new night of listening, only a new pair of eyes, and a new and quieter question, and a way of looking at the haystack itself that no one had quite thought to try yet. The eyes belonged to a young astronomer named Sofia Sheikh, and the question she carried into that archive was not the question everyone else had been asking. For months the world had wanted only one thing from the note that came from the direction of Proxima Centauri. Was it real? Was it them? Was that thin whistle a voice, or an accident, or some small lie told by the machine? Sheikh set all of that gently down. She did not walk up to the signal and demand that it confess what it was. She turned the other way. She looked at everything else in the data, all the other whistles and hums and ghosts that the great dish had gathered over its long nights, and she asked a smaller, slower, far more patient question. Not whether the note was alien, but whether the note was alone. And here, before we go any further into the dark, there is something you may need to quietly unlearn, because most of us carry a picture of how a moment like this gets settled, and the picture is almost entirely wrong. In that picture, a mysterious signal arrives, and the scientists gather around it in a bright room, and someone, after enough long nights, either proves that it came from another world, or proves that it came from a broken oven 3 miles down the road. Yes or no? True or false? A clean stamp pressed onto the whole affair, and everyone goes home. That is the story we tell ourselves. It is tidy, and it is comforting, and it is not how any of this actually happens. Not the proving, not the disproving, not the clean stamp at the end. Because a candidate like this is almost never disproven. Let that land for a moment. It is a strange thing to hold, half asleep in the dark, but it is the truth of the whole enterprise. Nobody ever stood up and demonstrated that the note from Proxima Centauri did not come from aliens. That is not a thing that can be done. You cannot reach across 4¼ light years and prove a negative. You cannot open the far end of that distance and show that no one is standing there. What actually happens is quieter and stranger than proof. A candidate is not defeated. A candidate is explained. It does not die when someone shows it is false. It dies the moment someone finds a more ordinary story that fits it just as well, or a little better, than the extraordinary one. And when that ordinary story arrives, the wonder does not shatter. It simply leaks away, slowly, the way warmth leaves a room, until one morning you notice the mystery has gone cold, and no single person can quite say the hour it happened. So the work was never going to be a hunt for a smoking gun. Not a triumphant reveal. Not a single line of code that flashed the word false. The work was going to be a slow act of undressing, one honest layer at a time, and the layer Sheikh reached for first was not the signal itself, it was the haystack around it. Think for a moment about what that dish had really been doing out there in the New South Wales night. It had not been listening for one note, it had been swallowing everything, every stray transmission, every satellite passing overhead, every microwave and phone and radar and idling engine within reach of its enormous ear, every accidental murmur of the whole electric human world, all of it poured into the recordings, alongside the thin, clean tone that everyone had fallen in love with. Somewhere in the analysis the number floated up that there were millions of signals in that data. Millions. Not one needle in one stack of hay. A field of needles, most of them dull, most of them obviously ours. A vast, glittering clutter of noise that the software had learned to sweep aside almost without looking. And the note from Proxima had survived that sweeping. That was the whole reason anyone cared. It had passed the checks that killed the others. It had come only when the dish looked at the star, and vanished when the dish looked away, and it had drifted in that slow wrong direction, and it sat at that one clean frequency, near 982 megahertz, and it had refused all the ordinary explanations that emptied the rest of the field. So the temptation, the natural human temptation, was to keep staring at the survivor, to lean closer and closer to the one note, to turn it over and over, to ask it again and again where it had come from, as though enough attention might finally break it open. Sheikh did the opposite, and this is the pivot of the entire story. The small turn of the head that changed everything, so let it be simple. She stopped asking what made the signal special. She started asking what made it ordinary. She went back into the haystack, into all the millions of signals the software had already thrown away, the dull and the obvious and the plainly human, and she began to look for family, not another voice, not a second message. She was looking for relatives, for other whistles that shared the survivor's habits, its shape, its manners, its particular way of walking through the frequencies. If the note from Proxima Centauri was truly a voice from another world, it should have no siblings here. It should stand alone in all that clutter, one of a kind, unrepeatable. But if it had brothers and sisters hiding in the noise, if the archive was quietly full of tones that behaved just like it, then the beautiful, lonely story would begin, very softly, to fall apart. You can feel, I think, where a search like that has to lead, and you do not need to brace for it. None of this is yours to carry. This all happened years ago, in rooms you will never see, to people who slept fine afterward and woke up and went to lunch. The signal is not in your room. The star is not at your window. Let your jaw unclench. Let the weight of the search settle out along the floor, somewhere far from the slow rise and fall of your own breathing, and simply follow the shape of it, the way you would follow a story someone tells you in a low voice when the lights are already out. Because the answer, when it came, was not the answer anyone had hoped for. It was not a message, not a greeting, not a second clearer note that finally confirmed the first. What Sheikh began to pull out of that haystack was a crowd, a whole hidden population of lookalikes, thin single tones scattered through the archive, spaced out across the frequencies, in a pattern that was far too neat to be a coincidence, and far too dull to be a wonder. Signals that carried the same needle sharpness the Proxima note had. Signals that drifted. Signals that wore, more or less, the same face. And the terrible, quiet, deflating thing about them, the thing that took the air out of the whole room without ever raising its voice, was where they showed up. They did not come only when the dish looked at the star. They came when it looked anywhere, when it pointed at the target and when it pointed at empty sky, when it was on source and when it was off. They did not care where the great ear was aimed, because they had never come from out there at all. And that changes the meaning of the survivor, doesn't it? Slowly. The way the meaning of a footprint changes when you find 100 more just like it, and realize you have been following your own trail in a circle. The note from Proxima had passed the on-off check. It had appeared with the star and vanished without it, and that single fact had felt for a while like something close to proof. But if the sky was full of these tones, thin and drifting and patient, ready to slip through the exact same checks, then passing the check no longer meant what everyone had wanted it to mean. Not a fingerprint of a distant transmitter, not the signature of something reaching across the dark, but a coincidence dressed up in the clothing of a coincidence, a piece of the human electric world that had simply happened to switch itself on and off in a rhythm that matched, closely enough, the rhythm of the telescope's own slow nodding dance. That was the shape of the fragile hope collapsing, not with a bang, not with a headline, with a spacing, with a pattern in the frequencies that pointed not outward toward Proxima Centauri and its small warm planet, but inward, back toward the machines, back toward the wiring, back toward the low steady drone of our own inventions, humming to themselves in the dark. The very properties that had made the note extraordinary, its cleanness, its single unwavering pitch, its refusal to say anything at all, began to look less like the calling card of a mind and more like the tell of a circuit. Because a mind, given the chance to speak across 4¼ light years, might say something, might carry information, might rise and fall, might vary. This did none of that. It was just a tone, just one note, held and drifting and empty. And a held, empty, drifting note, it turns out, is exactly the kind of thing a piece of ordinary electronics is very, very good at producing entirely by accident. But knowing that the survivor had a family was only the beginning of the undressing. It told Sheikh that the note was not alone. It did not yet tell her how a signal born somewhere down here on the ground could learn to imitate a transmitter falling toward a star, how it could drift in that convincing wrong direction, how a dull piece of human hardware could counterfeit the one feature that had fooled the sharpest filters ever built. To understand that, you have to go down another layer still, into the strange arithmetic of how two ordinary hums, meeting at the wrong moment, can conspire to make a third sound that was never really there at all. Think of it this way. You have two sounds in a room, not loud sounds, two faint, steady hums, the kind you stop hearing after a minute, the kind your house makes all night while you sleep and never once wakes you. Each one sits at its own pitch and simply holds there. On their own, neither is interesting, neither is a mystery, neither would ever fool anyone. But bring them together inside a piece of imperfect electronics, some amplifier or mixer or cable that does not behave in a perfectly clean and orderly way, and something small and strange happens. The two hums do not just add, they multiply, they fold across each other, and out of that folding, new tones appear at frequencies where nothing is actually being transmitted at all. Ghost pitches. Sounds that exist only because two real sounds happen to meet in a component that was not quite honest about keeping them separate. Engineers have a name for these ghosts. They call them intermodulation products. And the word product is exact, because they really are a kind of arithmetic. Take one frequency, take another, and the misbehaving hardware quietly starts adding them and subtracting them and doubling them and mixing the results. And every one of those combinations shows up as a faint new line in the radio spectrum. A tone at the sum, a tone at the difference, a tone at twice the first minus the second. None of them broadcast by anything, all of them as sharp and narrow and clean looking as a real transmission, because they are born from real transmissions, just recombined. To the telescope, to the software, to the sharpest filters ever built, a ghost like this does not look like noise. Noise is broad and shapeless. This is a needle. And a needle is exactly what everyone had been trained to get excited about. So here is the reversal, the thing that turns the whole story on its heart. The very quality that made the Proxima signal feel alien, that pure single needle-thin note with no static around it, was never evidence of intelligence. It was the fingerprint of a machine, not a machine 4¼ light years away, orbiting a red star. A machine down here, a machine in a building, or a piece of test equipment, or a component in the receiver itself, doing the small dishonest thing that imperfect electronics have always done. The narrowness was not the sound of a beacon, it was the sound of arithmetic. And this is where you have to let go of the version of the story you may have arrived with tonight, because most people carry one of two beliefs about this signal, and both of them are wrong. The first belief is that it was real, that scientists caught something from another world and then quietly buried it. That is not what happened. Nothing was buried. The second belief is the opposite, that it was instantly obvious junk, a satellite or a phone tower, laughed off in an afternoon. That is not what happened either. The truth lives in the uncomfortable space between those two easy stories, and the space is this. It was not a signal from Proxima Centauri. But it was also not a mistake anyone should have caught sooner. It slipped through because it was genuinely, honestly, one of the hardest fakes the universe of human noise has ever produced. It earned its year of doubt. Now hold on to the one detail that had unsettled everyone the most: the drift. Remember that the tone did not sit still. It slid upward in frequency across the recording, and it slid in the wrong direction. The direction a stationary thing on Earth should not slide. The direction you would expect from a transmitter accelerating out there in space. That drift was the crown jewel of the mystery. It was the single feature that whispered this is not from here. And the arithmetic of the ghosts explains even that. Because the two real hums that were feeding the ghost were not perfectly frozen. They wandered, just slightly, the way all electronics wander as they warm and cool and age through a night. And when you subtract one slowly wandering tone from another slowly wandering tone, the ghost you get can drift far faster and far cleaner than either parent ever did. A tiny wobble in the sources becomes a smooth, confident slide in the product. The signal drifted at roughly 0.04 of 1 Hz every second. A change so gentle it would take hours to shift by any amount your ear could ever notice. And yet that gentle wrong-way slide was not the star moving. It was two thermostats, so to speak, breathing slightly out of step, and the difference between their breaths pretending to be a world in motion. This is what Sofia Sheikh meant when she stopped hunting the single note and started hunting its family. Once she knew to look for ghosts instead of a beacon, The archive gave itself up. She found not one lonely tone, but a whole hidden population of them. Dozens of narrowband whistles scattered through the data, and when she laid out the frequencies where they lived, they were not random, they were spaced. Evenly. At intervals that lined up with simple multiples of the frequencies that common electronic oscillators use, the plain little crystal clocks that tick inside ordinary human devices by the millions. Real signals from real stars do not arrange themselves in the tidy multiplication table of a hardware catalogue. Interference does. The family was not a coincidence, it was a signature. And once she could see the signature, the single note stopped being a stranger and became just the most convincing member of a crowd she now recognized. That was the finding that ended it, at least on paper. When the analysis was finally published, it did not call the Proxima signal a transmission, or a beacon, or even an unknown. It called it, in the careful language of the journals, an electronically drifting intermodulation product of local, time-varying interferers aligned with the observing cadence. Say that softly to yourself and let it dissolve, because you do not need to hold the words, only the shape of them. It means a ghost made of Earth's own hum, drifting because the hum drifted, appearing only when the telescope happened to be looking at the star, because that was simply when the recording was running. Not a message, not a mistake, a product. The most honest fake the search had ever produced, taken apart at last into the small, dull, entirely human parts it had always been made of. And you might think that would be the end of the feeling, that naming the ghost would banish it, the way turning on a light empties a dark room of everything your mind had put there. But it does not, quite. Because Sheikh herself, the person who did more than anyone to unmask it, would not say the word certain. She would not close the door all the way. There was a reason for that. A small, stubborn, exact reason. And it has nothing to do with wishful thinking, and everything to do with what a proof actually is. Naming the family of ghosts told her what the signal almost certainly was. It did not, on its own, let her point at the one machine, in the one moment, that had made this one note. And that missing certainty, that hairline gap between almost and entirely, is the next thing you and I have to walk down into. So come down into it with me, slowly, the way you would lower yourself into cool water on a warm night, 1 inch at a time, in no hurry to reach the bottom. There is nothing to brace for here. What we are about to look at is not a new fact and not a twist in the story. It is smaller and stranger than that. It is the shape of a doubt. A single, exact, well-behaved doubt that a careful scientist chose to keep alive on purpose. And understanding why she kept it is going to teach you something about the whole idea of knowing anything at all. Here is the thing your body already believes, but has never been asked to say out loud. In ordinary life, you and I round. We do it constantly, without noticing, the way you breathe without counting the breaths. When something is unlikely enough, we quietly move it into the box marked never, and we close the lid, and we go on with our evening. The odds that the road is washed out on the drive you take every day. The odds that the plane falls. The odds that the person you love does not come home. We do not walk around holding those numbers. We could not. So the mind performs a small mercy on itself. It takes the very small and it files it under zero, and it lets us sleep. That rounding is not a flaw. It is most of what lets a person be calm in a world made of odds. But it is a habit of the mind, not a law of the universe. And the universe does not round. That is the whole of the gap we came down here to see, between what the mind does with a small number and what the number actually is. Think of what Sheikh had in front of her by the end. She had a signal that was almost certainly nothing. She had a family of look-alike tones scattered through the archive, spaced at neat little intervals that matched the frequencies of ordinary electronic parts, the kind of quiet hum a machine makes just by being switched on and running. She had 39 more hours of the telescope pointed back at the same star, listening and coming home with silence. She had a separate calculation, worked out by other people from first principles, that put the odds of a radio-shouting civilization sitting right there at the closest star at something like 1 in 100 million. 1 in 100 million. Let that number find a shape. If you took every person alive on the Earth right now, all of them, every face in every city, and you needed to pick out one particular person, one without a name, without a clue, on the first try, you would be reaching into odds gentler than that. That is how thin the case for aliens had become. Thinner than a single face in the whole human crowd. And your mind, hearing that, does what mine does. It rounds. It says, well, then it was nothing. Case closed. Turn off the light. Sheikh would not turn off the light. Not all the way. Because 1 in 100 million is not 0. And she knew, better than anyone in the room, that the difference between an extraordinarily small number and true 0 is not a small difference at all. It is the difference between the whole of science and something else entirely. To say a thing is nearly impossible is a measurement. To say it is impossible is a promise, and it is a promise you almost never actually get to make. This is the part everyday life hides from you, tucks away under the floorboards so you can function. Proving that something is there and proving that something is not there are not two versions of the same task. They are not even the same kind of task. They do not weigh the same. They never have. Picture it plainly. To prove the note was a message, you would have needed one thing. One. You would have needed to catch it again, to point the great dish back at that quarter-degree patch of sky where Proxima Centauri sits, 4¼ light-years off, and hear the same needle-thin whistle come sliding up through the frequencies a second time, on its own schedule, keeping its own promise. One clean repeat, and the argument would have been over. That is how the yes works. The yes is a single door that opens once and cannot be unopened. Another astronomer put it about as bluntly as it can be put. If an independent team on a different telescope could recover the same signal, then yes. Then it becomes real. Then you have to take it seriously. One recovery. That was the whole bar. But the no does not have a single door. The no is built the other way around. And this is the quiet, vertiginous heart of it. To prove the note was nothing, you cannot ever find the one thing that settles it. You can only keep taking things away. You strip off the satellite, you strip off the pulsar, you strip off the obvious local static, the kind the on-off nodding was built to catch. You find the family of hardware tones and you strip those off too. You listen for 39 more hours and you strip off its return. And with every layer you peel back, the pile of things it is not grows taller, and the space left for it to be something grows smaller, and smaller, and smaller. But it never on its own closes. You are stacking negatives. Not this, not that, not the other. A whole tower of knots. Each one true, each one earned, each one a real piece of work by real people at a real machine. And a tower of knots, however high you build it, is never the same shape as a single, standing yes. You can pile the negatives to the ceiling, and the last thin sliver of maybe still sits there at the top, quiet, uncollapsed, refusing to become 0, because 0 was never a thing you could reach from below. Feel the difference in your chest, softly, and then let it go. You do not need to carry it, but feel it once. The yes is a lightning strike. It happens in an instant, or it does not happen. The no is an erosion. It wears the mountain down grain by grain over a long, patient labour, and no matter how low you wear it, there is always one more grain. And here is where it gets stranger still, where the deep time of the thing opens up under your feet. Even after all of that peeling away, Sheikh and the others never actually found the culprit. They named the family. They understood the mechanism. The official words, when they finally wrote them down, were careful and exact, and almost tender in how much they refused to overclaim. Not an extraterrestrial technosignature, they wrote, but an electronically drifting intermodulation product of local, time-varying interferers, aligned with the observing cadence. Read past the machinery of that sentence, and here is what it is quietly admitting. Some small piece of human hardware, somewhere in the ordinary world, was humming and drifting and doing its dull mechanical business, and its stray notes happened to mix together in just such a way that the sum came out looking like a transmitter accelerating away on a distant world. They knew that kind of thing had done it. They could not point at the one that did. So the actual source, the specific object, the exact humming thing that made this exact note on this exact night in the Australian autumn of 2019 was never identified. It was never caught, never switched off in front of a witness, never held up and said, this is the one. It made its single note and it fell silent, and it slipped back into the enormous grey ocean of ordinary human noise, and the precise moment that produced the whistle receded into the past, like everything else recedes into the past. Unrepeatable, unrecoverable, gone. The intern found the ghost a year after it was born. By the time anyone understood what family of ghosts it belonged to, the individual ghost itself had been dead and buried for years, and no exhumation would ever bring back the one machine that mattered. They solved the case. They never found the body. That is why she would not say certain. Not out of some soft hope that it might still be aliens after all. She had done more than anyone in the world to make sure it was not. She would not say the word because the word was not hers to say. Because a proof is a specific thing with a specific shape, and what she had, however overwhelming, was not that shape. It was a tower of knots, and a missing culprit, and a probability worn down to 1 in 100 million. And all of that together is cold, in the honest language of people who measure things, extraordinarily low. It is not cold zero, and she was too good at her work to round it there, even to help you sleep, even though every ordinary instinct in every ordinary mind, including yours, including mine, wanted her to. There is a kind of courage in that, in holding a number exactly where it truly is, instead of where it would be comfortable. And underneath the courage there is something even older and even quieter, a truth about the whole enterprise of looking up at the sky and asking whether anyone is looking back. Because if a single note this small, this local, this thoroughly explained, can leave a hairline of doubt that even its own destroyer will not seal, then you begin to understand what the people who do this actually live inside, what they can and cannot ever promise you. And to feel the full weight of that, we have to go one layer further down, into the last and strangest thing this whole affair leaves standing. The strangest thing is not the note itself, it is the shape of the silence that came after it, and what that silence is quietly allowed to mean. Because a signal that arrives once, and never again, sits in a place ordinary life has no room for. Think about how you actually decide that something is real. Not the small things, the real things. You decide something is real when it happens more than once, when you can turn back to it, and it is still there. When someone else can stand where you stood and see the same thing you saw. That is the whole quiet machinery of knowing. Repetition. Confirmation. A fact is simply a thing the universe will do again if you ask it politely enough, with a big enough dish, at the right hour of the night. And this one note would not do it again. That is the layer beneath all the others, and it is stranger than any transmitter. Sofia Sheikh and the people around her went back and listened for 39 more hours. 39 hours of pointing the same kind of ear at the same small red star, waiting for the whistle to come back and be caught in the act, waiting to trap it, to prove it, or to prove it false once and forever. And in all 39 of those hours, nothing came. Not the tone, not a cousin of the tone, not a whisper near 982, just the ordinary hiss of a cooling sky. And here is the thing you have to sit with, softly, without letting it wake you. That silence did not settle the question. It could not. A signal that will not return cannot be lifted up into a fact, and it cannot be pushed all the way down into a mistake. It simply stays where it is, in a small locked room of its own, holding the door shut from the inside. The astronomer Shami Chatterjee said it as plainly as it can be said. Independent recovery was the real bar. If some other team, with some other telescope, on some other night, could reach out and catch the same signal for themselves, then, in his words, hell yes, it would have to be taken seriously. That is the test. Not cleverness, not excitement, not a razor-thin line drifting the wrong way. Recovery. Someone else, somewhere else, finding it again. And that is the exact bar this signal was never able to clear. Not because anyone stopped trying, because it never showed its face a second time to anyone. You have met this ghost before tonight, though it wore a different name. Back in the summer of 1977, a telescope in Ohio called the Big Ear was sweeping a patch of sky toward the constellation Sagittarius, and for 72 seconds it heard a narrowband tone near 1420 MHz, up near the singing frequency of hydrogen itself, roughly 30 times louder than the background hush around it. A man named Jerry Eman found it days later on a printout, circled the numbers by hand, and wrote a single word in the margin. Wow. And then, exactly like the note from Proxima, it was gone. People pointed telescopes back at that same square of Sagittarius for decades, years of listening, and the 72 seconds never came again. 2 signals, 2 lifetimes apart, and the same fate stitched through both of them. Heard once, circled, chased, and never ever recovered. This is where the negatives begin to stack, one on top of another, until they make a kind of tower you can feel leaning over you in the dark. It was not proven to be aliens. It was not proven to be interference beyond all doubt. Not really. Not the specific source, never pinned to a single machine anyone could point at. It did not repeat. It could not be confirmed. It could not be fully denied. Each of those is a small no, and by themselves they are nothing. They are the ordinary furniture of careful science, but laid one against the next, they build something that has no flaw, a thing that is almost certainly nothing, and yet cannot be finished, a door that is almost closed and will not latch. And here is the part your everyday life has quietly hidden from you, the part the mathematics knows and your body refuses to feel. That February, a separate study did the coldest possible arithmetic on the whole question, using nothing but the logic of averages and the assumption that we are not special, and it put the chance of a radio broadcasting civilization actually living at Proxima Centauri at around 1 in 100 million. 1 in 100 million. Say it slowly, because your mind is built to mishear it. A number that's small is not 0, but your body treats it as 0. The way you treat the chance of a meteor through your roof tonight as 0. The way you have to, or you could never lie still at all. Everyday living is only possible because your mind rounds. It rounds the almost impossible down into the impossible, and it rounds the very likely up into the certain, and it does this 1,000 times an hour so that you can function, so that you can sleep. But the physics does not round. The instruments do not round. 1 in 100 million stays exactly 1 in 100 million, no matter how badly the animal in you wants it filed under never. Now stretch that refusal to round across the sizes involved, and feel how far it runs. The light that carried this note crossed 4.2465 light years to reach the outback, which means it left that little star more than 4 years before any human hand ever touched the archive it was hiding in. And the survey that caught it is not aimed at one star, it is aimed at 1 million of them. $100 million and 10 years of nights, sweeping across 1 million suns and the long bright spine of the galaxy. And in a sky that wide, listen to that hungrily, a signal that arrives exactly once and then dissolves is not the rare exception. It may be the ordinary rule, because most of what a universe this large does, it does once, in some direction at some hour, in front of no one, and then it moves on, and the star that made it has already turned, already flared, already changed into something that would never make that same note again, even if you begged it. The sky is not a library you can walk back into. It is a river. Things pass. You see them pass, and then the water where they were is just water. So the last and strangest thing this whole affair leaves standing is not a spaceship and not an intern's lucky afternoon. It is a permanent, hairline maybe, sized at 1 in 100 million and refusing to shrink to nothing, hanging over the closest star to your own sun, hung there by people who did everything right, who chased it for 39 hours and could not lay it to rest, who wrote the honest word extraordinarily low precisely because they would not write the dishonest word never. That maybe is very small. It weighs almost nothing. It is not something you need to carry, and you may set it down now and let your shoulders drop and let the number go loose in your hands. But it does not vanish just because you have stopped holding it. It waits, and to understand what it truly means to live with a thing that small and that unkillable, forever open, forever quiet, we have to go down into one last layer, the final one, the one underneath even this. And the layer underneath is a question we have stepped around all night. The way you move through a dark room without quite touching its walls. We have spent hours asking whether the signal was real, whether that one narrow tone was a machine of ours or a machine of theirs, whether the intern found a ghost or found nothing at all. But there is a smaller, older question folded inside that one, and it does not care in the least whether the whistle was interference or wonder. It asks something simpler. It asks whether there was ever anything there to do the whistling. Set the signal aside for a moment, let it drift out of reach, and look instead at the place it seemed to come from, the actual ground beneath that quarter degree of sky. Because Proxima Centauri is not an empty star. That is the first thing to hold gently as you lie there. The nearest sun to your own is not a bare point of light burning alone in the dark. It has a companion. It has at least one world. In the years before any of this, before the intern, before the archive, before the 30 hours of listening in the outback, astronomers had already found a planet circling that star, and they gave it a plain and unglamorous name. Proxima b, not a number in a catalogue you will ever need to remember. Just the nearest planet beyond our own solar system that we know of, resting a little over 4 light-years from the bed that is holding you now. And it is, of all the strange things, roughly the size of the Earth, close to the same mass as the ground beneath your house. Not a swollen giant of gas, not a frozen pebble, but something near enough to Earth's own weight that if you could stand on it, the pull on your body might feel almost familiar. It circles its star fast. A single year there lasts a little over 11 days. 11 days, and the whole orbit is complete. You could live a year of that world in the span between 2 weekends, and it hugs its star close, closer than any planet in our own system hugs the Sun, orbiting at roughly 1/20th of the distance between the Earth and our own star. Picture your sun in the sky, and then slide it far nearer, until it hangs low and large and near over everything. That is the sky over Proxima b. And here is the small warm thing, the thread of hope in all of this. That close orbit, around that particular star, places the planet in what astronomers call the habitable zone. Not too hot, not too cold. The narrow band around a star where a world could, in principle, hold liquid water on its surface. The one substance every living thing we have ever known has needed. Proxima Centauri is cool and faint enough that its warm band lies pulled in tight against it, and Proxima b, hurrying around every 11 days, sits squarely inside it. Which means that the closest planet to us beyond the Sun's own family may be warm enough, just barely, for water to pool and stay. The nearest possibly living ground in the entire universe, as far as we know, is right there, next door, a little over 4 light-years away. Let that rest on you for a moment, before we take it away again. because the same closeness that warms the planet is also what may have doomed it. And this is the new dread, delivered softly, the one that sits underneath even the hairline maybe about the signal. Proxima Centauri is not a calm star. Our own sun is, by the standards of the galaxy, remarkably well behaved. It has its storms, its flares, its slow moods, but it burns steadily, and it has let life on your planet ripen for billions of quiet years. Proxima Centauri does not burn that way. It is what astronomers call a flare star, a star that flickers and convulses, that can brighten violently and without warning, throwing sudden enormous bursts of radiation off its surface. And because Proxima b orbits so close, 1/20th of an Earth's distance from that temper, it sits directly in the path of every outburst. In the same year the whistle was recorded, the same year the telescope in Australia was listening across those 30 hours, astronomers watching Proxima Centauri caught one of these outbursts in the act. A giant flare, an eruption of ultraviolet light off the star's surface. And when they measured its power, they found it was something like 10 times more energetic than the strongest flares our own sun has ever been recorded throwing. 10 times. Hold that against the planet sitting so near. A blast of radiation, 10 times fiercer than the worst our steady sun can manage, washing over a world huddled 20 times closer to its star than we are to ours, again and again, across the ages. Not once, not rarely, as a way of life. And a world takes that kind of beating in one of two ways. Either it holds on to its air, its atmosphere, that thin protecting shell of gas, the blanket that on your own planet keeps the cold out and the harmful light from reaching the ground, or, slowly, flare by flare, century by century, that shell is stripped away and boiled off into space, until the surface lies bare and scoured beneath the star's tantrums. And no one knows which of these happened at Proxima b. That is the honest shape of it. We do not know whether that Earth-sized world still wears an atmosphere at all, or whether it long ago lost the one thing that would let water stay and life begin. The hope and the dread are folded into a single small word, and the word is if. It may be warm enough for liquid water, if it is kept in atmosphere, and that if is doing an enormous amount of quiet work. So look at what we are actually holding now, here in the last layer. The whistle, that tone at one narrow frequency, seemed to come from the direction of a star that has a real planet. A planet close to the size of your own, sitting in the one thin band where water might survive. That is the part that made hearts beat faster in December, the part that no calm probability could entirely smother. But the same planet orbits a violent star that may have long since flayed it down to bare rock, which turns the hairline maybe into something even stranger than a maybe about a signal. It becomes a maybe about whether the very ground that tone pointed at could ever have held a hand to switch a transmitter on. Not one uncertainty, but two, stacked one beneath the other. Could anything survive there? And if it could not, then what exactly was the note that survived every check? You do not need to resolve that tonight. No one has resolved it in all the years since, and you are not required to be the one who does, lying there in the dark with your eyes already heavy. Let the two uncertainties settle into each other and go quiet. The planet may be alive, the planet may be dead, the signal may be a fluke of our own machines, the signal may be the one true thing we very nearly missed. All four of those can be true at once, inside the space of not knowing, and that space is soft, and it will hold them all without any help from you. Let your breathing slow. Let the star and its battered little world drift a comfortable distance away, and there is one more loose thread down here at the bottom, thin enough that it is easy to miss. When the scientists finally explained the whistle away, when they traced it to the ordinary hum of our own machines leaking into the telescope, they described what kind of thing it was. An artifact born from several local sources of interference blending together, drifting the way electronics drift as they warm and cool across a day. They knew its species. What they never did, in the end, was point at the exact machine. The specific device, somewhere on or near the ground, whose stray tone climbed 4 light-years worth of expectation before anyone caught it out. That precise culprit was never found and named. The explanation is almost certainly right. It is also, in its own small way, still open. The door is shut, and the latch was never quite thrown. And while that door hangs there, not open and not sealed, the listening has never stopped. The great project that caught the whistle in the first place was never built to answer a single star. It was built to comb through 1 million of them, the nearest million suns to your own, one patient pointing at a time, across years. Proxima Centauri was only the closest of them, the first doorstep, the nearest window to try. Beyond it lie all the others, most of that million still ahead, each one a star that may hold a world, each world a place that may, or may not, hold something that could one day make a note of its own on purpose. So this is where the science itself runs out of ground to stand on. Not with an answer, but with a shape. A star that is real. A planet that is real. A band of warmth that is real. And a violence that is real. And a signal that came. And a signal that went. And a maybe too small to weigh and too stubborn to erase. Every measurable thing has now been measured, and the measuring has only carried us to the edge of a far older question, one no telescope was ever built to settle, because underneath the frequency and the drift and the flare and the arc minutes of sky, underneath all of it, there is the plain and enormous fact that you are a living thing, lying in the dark, wondering whether you are alone. And that question does not belong to the instruments anymore. So let the dishes go on turning without you for a while, and let us step back from the numbers entirely and look at the thing they were always really about. But before we let go of the machinery entirely, there is one small, stubborn thing still resting inside it, and it is worth holding a moment longer, because it is the reason this story never quite closes. When the scientists finally named the whistle, when they wrote it down as interference and set it beside the hundreds of other false tones they had pulled out of the archive, they did something quietly unusual for people delivering a verdict. They did not claim to have found the guilty machine. They described the shape of the culprit, an electronic drift, a product of local devices humming along in step with the rhythm of the observations, and that description is almost certainly correct. But no one ever walked up to a single transmitter, some radio, some receiver, some piece of hardware on the ground, pointed to it, switched it off, and watched the signal die in front of witnesses. The source was named in kind, but never in body. The exact thing that made the tone was never held in a hand and shown to the world. So the case was closed the way most real cases close, not with a confession, but with a weight of evidence too heavy to argue against. And underneath that weight, the scientists left, on purpose, the smallest possible gap. They did not say the signal was human. They said the odds that it was anything else had become extraordinarily low. And extraordinarily low, if you sit with the words as they actually chose them, is not the same as nothing. The woman who took the haystack apart, who found the lookalike tones and built the case that undid the dream, was the one who said it most plainly. She could not, she admitted, say with total certainty that this was not a message from another technology. She could only say the chance of it had fallen to almost nothing. Almost. That single word did all the work, and she left it standing. That is the tiny hope. Not a discovery. Not a signal that survived. Just a crack of honesty in the door, held open by the very people who had every professional reason to close it. And you could rest there, if you wanted. You could let that small almost be enough, and let your shoulders drop, and let the number soften into the dark. There is nothing here you need to decide tonight, nothing you need to carry into the morning, but the hope does not come alone, and this is the last hard thing the science has to say before it goes quiet. Even if you let yourself believe, for one breath, that something down there had reached toward us, look at where it would have had to live. The only known world circling that star is a planet barely heavier than the one beneath you, pressed so close to its sun that a full year there passes in about 11 of your days. And that sun is not gentle. In the same stretch of time that the telescope was listening, astronomers watched Proxima Centauri throw off a single ultraviolet flare roughly 10 times more violent than the fiercest flare our own sun has ever been recorded making. A flare like that, again and again over the ages, is the kind of thing that strips a planet of its air, that scours a surface bare, that makes the very scientists who found the world doubt whether it could hold on to an atmosphere at all. So the hope, such as it is a hope for something living under a sun that lashes it. The warmth was real, the violence was just as real, and it was aimed at exactly the place the warmth was. And then there is the silence, which is the coldest fact of all. After the whistle was found, the same telescope was turned back toward that patch of sky, and it listened again, and it went on listening for 39 more hours, and in all of that time, the tone never came back. Not once. Whatever it was, it spoke a single time, across a single stretch of days in the outback autumn, and then it was gone as if it had never been. And if that shape feels familiar to you, it should, because it is exactly what happened once before, in the summer of 1977, when another dish heard one clean note out of the dark and never heard it again. 2 whistles, more than 40 years apart, and both of them vanished before anyone could hold them still. The universe, it seems, does not repeat itself for us on request. That was always the real bar, and it was never cleared. One of the astronomers watching from the outside put it as simply as it can be put. If another team, on another instrument, could catch the same signal again, then yes, he said, then it would mean something. Confirmation was never a matter of how strange or how beautiful the tone was. It was a matter of whether the sky would say it twice, and the sky said it once, and then it said nothing. And a thing said only once is a thing that can never quite be trusted and can never quite be dismissed. It simply stays, suspended, in the place where our certainty runs out. So this is where the instruments hand the question back. They have measured the frequency and the drift and the flare and the arc minutes of sky. They have combed the archive and found the false tones and left the one true gap standing. They have listened for 39 more hours and heard the silence answer. There is nothing more the dishes can do here. Not tonight. Not for a long while. And so they will do the only thing they know how to do, which is to turn, slowly away from this one star and toward the next. And the next. Because there are a million of them on the list. A million nearby suns still waiting to be listened to. And the searching does not stop simply because one candidate dissolved. But you are not a dish, and you cannot turn away so easily. The question that began as a single narrow tone, 982 megahertz, one note in the dark, has quietly outgrown every machine that was ever built to chase it. It has climbed up out of the frequency and the data and the papers, and it is here now, in the room, lying in the dark beside you, patient, ancient, and far larger than the small signal that woke it. So let the question stay where it is. Do not try to solve it tonight. It is not the kind of thing that resolves at this hour, in this light, and it was never really asking you to solve it. It was only asking you to hold it for a while, the way you are holding it now, loosely, without gripping. And so let the answers come the way the signal came, one at a time, drifting, and let them settle without needing to choose between them. Perhaps it was exactly what the papers concluded. Perhaps it was nothing more than the world's own machinery whispering back to itself. A stray product of some ordinary electronic thing humming somewhere on the ground. A hum that folded and multiplied and lined itself up, by pure accident, with the rhythm of the telescope's nodding, so that for a few narrow minutes it wore the perfect disguise of a star. Perhaps every strange property it had, the needle-thin tone at 982 megahertz, the slow climb of its frequency, the way it seemed to point straight back at Proxima Centauri and nowhere else, was just the ordinary arranging itself into the shape of the extraordinary, the way clouds arrange themselves into faces, the way the mind on the edge of sleep hears its own name in the hush of the room. Perhaps the intern found nothing at all, only a very convincing kind of nothing, and the whole year the signal waited in the archive it was already empty, already answered, waiting only for someone patient enough to prove it hollow. Or perhaps not entirely, because here is the honest thing, the thing they were careful to say out loud, even as they closed the case. They never found the source. They named the family the signal belonged to. They traced the fingerprints of local interference all through the archive. They showed that tones like it appeared no matter where the great dish was aimed. And they built, out of all that patient detective work, a conclusion strong enough to publish and stand behind. That the exact machine that made this one particular tone, the specific humming thing that happened to be weird in just the right way at just the right moment, was never pinned to a bench and pointed at. It was inferred. It was reasoned. It was cornered by the weight of the evidence until there was almost nowhere left for it to hide. But almost is not the same as nowhere, and so the probability that it came from something out there, from a transmitter turning slowly on a world 4¼ light years away, was pressed down and down until it was extraordinarily low. Not zero. Extraordinarily low. Those were the words they chose, and they chose them on purpose. Because a scientist who has looked carefully knows the difference between a door that is closed and a door that is merely almost closed, and knows better than to lie about which one is which. One woman who spent longer with this signal than almost anyone else put it as plainly as it can be put. She said that given a haystack of millions of signals, the most likely explanation is still that it came from human technology, something that happened to be strange in exactly the way needed to slip past the filters. And then she said the other half, the half that matters here in the dark. She said we still cannot say with total certainty that it was not a signal from another technology, only that the chance of that had become extraordinarily small. Both halves are true at once. That is not a contradiction. That is just what honesty sounds like when the subject is large enough. So you are left with two shapes of the same night, and you do not have to pick between them. You can let them lie side by side the way you are lying here. It was almost certainly the ground talking to itself. And it is not quite impossible that it was something else. Both of those are allowed to be true in the same breath, and neither one is going to wake you, because the truth of it does not press on you the way a bill or a worry presses. It only rests there, enormous and quiet, asking nothing. And this is yours now, this small permission, so take it. You are allowed to not know. You have spent your whole waking life being asked to have answers, to be certain, to decide, to close every question before you are allowed to rest. But this one is not yours to close. No one alive has closed it completely. Some of the most careful people who have ever pointed a machine at the sky sat with this exact uncertainty, wrote it into their papers, said it out loud into microphones, and then went home and slept anyway. If they could carry it without needing to finish it, then so can you tonight more easily than they did, because nothing depends on you here. You do not have to file a report on the morning. You do not have to be right. You only have to let the not knowing be a soft thing instead of a sharp one. And it will be soft, if you let it, the way a wide, dark field is soft, the way deep water is soft when you finally stop trying to stand. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding. Let the jaw loosen. There is nothing in this question that requires your effort, and there never was. The dishes will keep listening whether you are awake or asleep. The archives will keep filling. Somewhere, at this very hour, a telescope is turning toward a star you will never learn the name of, gathering a whisper that some future intern will find, a year late, in a river of numbers, and the whole strange, patient human process of hoping and checking and hoping again will go on exactly as it has, and it does not need you to witness it. You are free to close your eyes on all of it. The searching is in good hands. It is simply not your watch, and it helps, maybe, to remember how small the thing was, and how far it had to come, and how that smallness makes the whole story gentler rather than sharper. One note, not a message, not a warning, not a voice speaking words, only a single sustained tone, thinner than anything a human throat could hold, riding across a distance so wide that the light itself, the fastest thing there is, needed more than 4 years just to cross it. If it had been real, if it had truly come from that faint red star, it would have left before you had ever heard of it, travelled the whole dark gap while you were busy living an ordinary handful of years, and arrived at a dish in the Australian outback to be written down, unnoticed, and set aside. That is the scale you are lying inside of now, not the scale of the room, though the room is real, and warm, and close. The other scale. The one where a whole year can pass with a possible answer to the oldest question sitting quietly in a file, and no one feels a thing. Because that is the part that stays with you, is it not? Once the frenzy and the papers and the careful debunking have all settled. Not whether it was aliens, it almost certainly was not. The part that stays is that it could have been, and no one would have known for a year, that the universe could, in principle, say the largest thing it has ever said, and say it so softly, in a single unremarkable tone, that it would land in a machine and wait there patient, while the world went on drinking its coffee and losing its keys and falling asleep in dark rooms. Whatever else this signal turned out to be, it taught that much for free, that the answer, if it ever comes, may not come as thunder. It may come as one thin note that has to wait for someone to notice it. It may already have come. It may be waiting somewhere right now. And that is not a frightening thought, not here, not the way it is told to you now. It is almost tender. It means the enormous thing, if it is out there, is not loud, not hungry, not rushing toward you. It is quiet. It keeps its own slow time, the way the star keeps its 11-day orbit and its sudden flares, the way the light keeps its 4-year crossing, the way the whole sky keeps turning without asking anyone to hurry. You are a small warm thing inside a very large and very patient dark, and the dark has never once been in a rush. It can wait for the intern, it can wait for the paper, it can wait for you to sleep and wake and sleep again 1,000 times, and it will still be there, holding its one note or its silence, exactly as it is holding it now. So let the largeness be a comfort tonight instead of a weight. It does not need anything from you. It is not measuring you. It has been here, in one form or another, far longer than the question, far longer than the telescope, far longer than the name of the star, and it will outlast every machine that was ever pointed at it. And you get, for the length of this one night, to simply belong to it, to be one more quiet thing resting inside the quiet, no more required to solve it than the dust is required to solve it, no more expected to answer than the star is expected to answer back. And perhaps that is the truest thing anyone will ever be able to say about the little tone at 982 megahertz. Perhaps it was only hardware after all, some cheap oscillator humming in a nearby town, its echo folded and drifted until it wore the exact disguise of a world calling out. Perhaps it was something stranger that we simply do not have the instruments to name yet, a coincidence so precise it will never come apart cleanly. Or perhaps the honest shape of it is the one Sofia Sheikh left us with, extraordinarily low, but never quite zero, a door pushed almost shut and held there, one thin sliver of light still coming through the gap. 39 more hours of listening did not close it. The silence since has not closed it. It simply waits, unfinished, the way the best questions do. And here is the gift in that, the thing you are allowed to carry down into sleep. You do not have to decide. You are not the jury on this. You can let it stay open or let it stay closed, and either way the star will not mind, and either way you have lost nothing. You are permitted, tonight, to hold a mystery without solving it, to let it rest on your chest as lightly as your own breathing, and to feel no urgency at all about which way it finally falls. Let that be enough. Let the not knowing be a soft place rather than a sharp one, because out there, while you drift, the machines are still turning, the dishes at Parkis and at Green Bank, are still swinging slowly across the dark, still nodding on and off the way they nodded across Proxima that autumn, still swallowing the faint rain of radio that has been falling on this planet since long before anyone thought to catch it. The million nearest stars are still there, most of them never once truly listened to, each one holding whatever it holds. Proxima is still exactly where it was, 4.25 light years out, its small red fire flickering, its one known world turning through its 11-day year, its flares still washing over everything close. Somewhere a signal you will never hear is already crossing the space between, already on its way, indifferent to whether you are awake to receive it. And that is not a lonely thought. That is the opposite of a lonely thought. It means the searching does not depend on you, that the listening goes on gently and patiently in your absence, that the sky is being attended to by quiet people at quiet consoles while you rest. You are never required to solve the heavens. You are only ever invited to look up at them for a while, and to feel the size of it all without fear, and then to set it down and close your eyes. The awe was always meant to loosen you, not to hold you awake. So let it loosen you now. Let the star drift back to its distance. Let the one note fade back into the noise it may have always been. Let the question stay open on the far side of the room, patient, unhurried, in no danger of leaving. And whenever another night comes, and you want another slow walk out into the dark, gravity of sleep will be here, holding the next quiet journey for you, in no rush at all. For now there is nothing left to reach for. There is only the dark, and the far red star, and your own slow breathing, and the strange comfort that some things are simply meant to stay unanswered. It was almost certainly nothing, and yet for one long night the sky leaned close, and something in us went quietly on listening.